Thank you so much for joining us for another edition of All Angles. I'm Dion Jax Miller. Coming up in the program this evening, we are going to be talking about reopening our borders with tourism set to kick into high gear once again. How do we manage COVID-19 in those circumstances? But first, though, we have for you the chilling story of an inmate who died in prison this year after being in prison 40 years without trial. INDECOM, the Independent Commission of Investigations, has described the incident as a disgrace. Viewers are warned some of the images you are about to see may be disturbing. On an editorial note, we did get permission from the inmate's family has given permission for these images to be shown.
After 40 years in prison without a trial, Noel Chambers' life was sucked out of him in every sense.
His body was covered with vermin bites, and there were live bed bugs, popularly called in Jamaica chink, all over his body, and he was suffering bed sores.
How and why did this happen? The Independent Commission of Investigations launched a probe after his death in January this year. The report says there was confusion at the Department of Correctional Services whether Mr. Chambers was in fact convicted for murder.
The Department of Correctional Services reports that he was convicted of murder and deemed unfit to plea, which of course cannot be, the two things cannot be true. You cannot be unfit to plea and be tried and convicted.
And so, INDECOM did its own checks.
His committal document from the court showed that he was in fact not convicted of any offense, but was unfit to plea and was being held on remand to see if his fitness to plea would improve.
In fact, at least 3 psychiatric reports between 2003 and 2008 declared Mr. Chambers fit to plea, but he was never taken back to court. But how could he be held for so long without trial? He was being held at the Governor General's pleasure. This happens when someone is found unfit to plead by the court. There are currently 9 other prisoners with similar situations, and so INDECOM is calling for changes to prevent a repeat. Since 2000, the Commissioner of Corrections is required to provide monthly updates to the court on the conditions of persons unfit to plea.
When we asked the Commissioner of Corrections to show us these reports, no such reports could be produced. It would seem that the only way in which these persons are brought back to court is if they are able to have lawyers bring back their cases for them.
He says it is a woeful failure of the state. The report is also recommending a psychiatric ward in prisons
for mentally ill persons who come in conflict with the law, so that they can receive proper treatment and humane conditions of treatment. We're recommending that there be a proper system in place for the review of persons who are unfit to plea, so that their cases can be returned to court when they may become fit to plea.
He also wants persons being held at the Governor General's pleasure to be brought under the court's pleasure so the courts can review these cases and for prison staff to be trained to care for mentally ill persons.
It is a disgrace that in a civilized country such as Jamaica, someone like Noel Chambers would have had to suffer these conditions that he did, and that there are others suffering similar conditions.
Giovanni Dennis, TVJ News.
Now, joining me in this segment of the program to comment, we have human rights activist and blogger Susan Goff, and public law barrister Matonda Makula joins us as well from the UK. Thank you both so much. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Good evening, Dion. Good evening, Ms. Goff.
Good evening.
Matonda, let me ask you, talk to us a little bit more, first of all, about this whole idea of being detained at the pleasure of the Governor General or detained at the pleasure of the court.
Well, effectively, as yet indicated, under our system in Jamaica, if, for example, you are a young person who has committed a capital offense like murder, or child, a young person, a child, then you can be held, instead of being given a particular prison sentence for a specific number of years, you are effectively held at the Governor General's pleasure. If, for example, again, you're someone who has been deemed by the court as not being able to enter a plea, i.e., you cannot say I'm guilty or not guilty because of your mental health condition, then you can technically be held at the Governor General's stroke the court's pleasure. The feature that you ran earlier did say that the Mr. Terrence Williams has asked in his recommendation that all those who are held at the Governor General's pleasure should automatically go under the court's pleasure, which is really a statutory requirement, which is really a statutory category of the court's pleasure. This is because of what transpired in the Privy Council decision some time ago, where effectively, if you're being detained at the Governor General's pleasure, it is the executive, the Governor General, who's making that decision. And in our system, the executive does not have that power. And so, whilst we still have that that thing of the Governor General's pleasure, it's really what we need to have is for everyone to move automatically over to being detained at the court's pleasure if he or she is, for example, unfit to plead.
So what's supposed to happen though? Because surely you're not supposed to be held forever and ever, amen.
No, there is if you're unfit to plead, there is a statutory review system in place. There's a statutory review system in place. And the problem here is, frankly speaking, is that the Commissioner of Corrections fell down on his job. And frankly speaking, he should be tendering his resignation, because there is a review system in place. And clearly, in the case of Mr. Chambers, he was not able to show INDECOM where and when these reviews took place. And I'm sure the other 9 or so persons who are presently detained, and up to, in one case, I think 49 years. I would love to see him the Commissioner of Correction produce the report that shows that a review has been conducted and what has been the result of the review, but not necessarily this particular commissioner. This particular commissioner should tender his resignation.
Why?
Well, because there is a review procedure in place, one that clearly has not been adhered to under the statute or under the correctional institutional rules of 1991. Or thirdly, the state, in the form of the Department of Correctional Services, has a positive duty to uphold every single human right that the inmates enjoy when they are in the institution. And if he or she, if the officer, Commissioner of Corrections, has not carried out that positive duty, then that's a failure on the part of the head of the institute of the service. And so, in that regard, that failure should trigger some response.
So you're speaking as well about the condition in which he was at the time of his death, his physical condition?
Conditions, yes, because clearly there must have been a lack of attention to the fact that he has, whenever an individual is in the state's care in an institution such as that, that person is entitled not to be subjected to any inhumane or degrading treatment. Well, the lack of proper access to medical care and facilities can and has been held by courts across the Commonwealth to constitute inhumane treatment. And so if that, this is just what we're looking at here is not necessarily a failure or absence of law or laws, but it's a failure of the process to work, because those who have been given the responsibility to ensure that it worked clearly did not fulfill their obligations.
Let me bring Susan Goff in here now. Terrence Williams of INDECOM said this situation was a disgrace. What do you call it?
I think it is a horrifying indictment on the state and the people of Jamaica that these extreme inhumane conditions continue to exist for decades in our society. Mr. Noel Chambers' death has brought once again to the forefront that inherently unjust situation in which people are held, are committed to the very same prison that they would be committed to if convicted, because they are unfit to plead because of their mental condition. And they languish there and suffer there for extreme periods of time. And then you have, in this instance, the condition in which Mr. Chambers died. His physical condition illustrates that he must have been subjected to severe inhumane treatment, a lack of proper food, a lack of proper medical care, a lack of attention that could have him dying in the condition that he did. And our political leaders over decades and across administrations have presided over it. In 2001, we had the case of Ferdy Nettleford, otherwise known as Ivan Barrows, who was released after 28 years. And that was the work of the Independent Jamaica Council for Human Rights and Nancy Anderson.
Let me ask you to hold that thought for me, Susan Goff. We're going to pick up on that when we come back, but I do have to go to the break. We're talking to Susan Goff and Matanda Makulu, reacting to the INDECOM report published today about the condition of some men being kept in the care of the state in our prisons without trial. Stay tuned.